This is the incredible true story of how one moment of unforgivable cruelty and criminal disrespect led to one of the most powerful demonstrations of grace under extreme pressure ever witnessed, proving that sometimes the most devastating responses to evil come not from violence or revenge, but from the quiet authority of a man who understands the difference between strength and brutality, between honor and intimidation. September 23, 1975. The Casino de Monte Carlo was experiencing one of its most exclusive evenings of the year. The legendary gambling establishment, which had been the playground of European royalty and international high society since 1863, was hosting a private poker tournament in its most prestigious salon privé. The event was by invitation only, with a minimum buy-in that ensured only the wealthiest and most influential figures from across Europe would be seated at the green felt tables. Among the carefully selected participants that evening was 39-year-old Alain Delon, who had become not just one of the most celebrated actors in international cinema, but also a sophisticated businessman with interests that extended far beyond the entertainment industry. His presence at the tournament was both social and professional. He enjoyed the intellectual challenge of high-stakes poker, and the casino provided opportunities to meet potential investors and business partners from the upper echelons of European society. The Salon Privé was an environment of understated luxury and refined elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables covered in the finest green baize, while uniformed dealers moved with the practiced efficiency that characterized Monte Carlo's legendary service. The atmosphere was one of controlled tension and sophisticated competition, where fortunes could be won or lost with the turn of a single card. At Alain's table that evening were 5 other players, each representing different aspects of European wealth and influence. There was Heinrich von Habsburg, an Austrian industrialist whose family had maintained their fortune through careful investments in manufacturing and real estate. Beside him sat Lady Margaret Pemberton, an English aristocrat whose title came with both ancient prestige and modern financial acumen. But the most notable and dangerous presence at the table was Marcel Antonelli, known throughout the criminal underworld as Le Corse, a reference to his Corsican origins and his position as one of the most powerful organized crime figures operating between Marseille and the Italian Riviera. Antonelli had built his empire through a combination of traditional criminal enterprises and increasingly sophisticated involvement in legitimate businesses that provided cover for money laundering and illegal operations. At 52, Marcel was a man who commanded respect through fear and intimidation. His presence at the Monte Carlo tournament was tolerated because his money was as good as anyone else's, and because the casino's management understood that excluding him would create what Marcel knew and what he was preparing to use as a weapon in the psychological warfare that often accompanied high-stakes gambling, was one of the most painful chapters in Alain's personal history. In 1960, when Alain was just beginning his career in cinema, his younger brother Jean-Claude had been killed while serving with the French army in Algeria. The loss had devastated Alain and his family, and it remained a source of profound grief that he rarely discussed publicly. The military service and subsequent death of Jean-Claude represented something sacred in French culture: the sacrifice of young men for their country's interests, the bonds of brotherhood, and the honor that came with serving one's nation even in an unpopular and controversial war. For Marcel to know about this tragedy and to consider using it as ammunition in a poker game revealed something fundamentally evil about his character. As the next hand was being dealt, Marcel decided to escalate his psychological attack with a comment that would cross every line of decency and respect that civilized society recognized. Speaking of family protection, Marcel said, his eyes fixed on Alain with the cold stare that had intimidated countless victims throughout his criminal career. "I heard your brother couldn't even protect himself in Algeria. What kind of soldier gets killed by a bunch of peasants? Guess the Delon family isn't as tough as people think." The effect of these words was immediate and devastating. The other players at the table stopped what they were doing and stared at Marcel in horror, recognizing that something unforgivable had just occurred. Lady Margaret actually gasped audibly, while Heinrich's face went pale with shock at the cruelty of the comment. To mock a man's dead brother was bad enough, but to mock a brother who had died in military service was to attack not just personal grief, but national honor, military sacrifice, and the sacred bonds of family that formed the foundation of civilized society. It was the kind of comment that in previous eras would have resulted in immediate challenges to duels, and in the modern criminal world often led to violence and bloodshed. All eyes turned to Alain, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented attack on his family's honor and his brother's memory. The silence in the salon privé was complete and tense, with even the sounds of other games in the casino seeming to fade away as everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Marcel sat back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, clearly expecting his psychological attack to either provoke Alain into an emotional outburst that would give Marcel an advantage in the game, or to intimidate him into backing down and revealing weakness that Marcel could exploit further. What happened next would be discussed and remembered in Monte Carlo society for decades to come. Alain did not raise his voice. He did not stand up or make threatening gestures. He did not even change his expression significantly. Instead, he carefully placed his cards face down on the table, folded his hands calmly, and looked directly at Marcel with the kind of steady, analytical gaze that had made him so compelling in his most dramatic film roles. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, but it carried across the silent salon with perfect clarity and devastating authority. The words were delivered with such calm precision and moral authority that they carried far more impact than any shouting or threats could have achieved. Marcel, who was accustomed to being feared and respected in his criminal world, found himself being dissected and dismissed by someone who operated from a completely different moral universe. The other players at the table were stunned by the quiet power of Alain's response. Lady Margaret later described it as watching someone defend the honor of the dead with words that were more powerful than any weapon. Heinrich would say that he had never seen anyone respond to such cruelty with such dignity and devastating effectiveness. But Alain was still not finished. His final words would complete the destruction of Marcel's attempt at intimidation and establish a moral authority that left no doubt about who represented civilization and who represented barbarism. "In my family, Monsieur Antonelli, we honor those who sacrifice for others and who live with integrity. We do not mock the dead. We do not prey upon the innocent, and we do not mistake cruelty for strength. That is the difference between us, and that is why you will always be exactly what you are, a small man who can only feel important by making others suffer." The salon privé remained completely silent for what seemed like an eternity. Marcel, who had begun the exchange confident in his ability to intimidate and humiliate Alain, now found himself exposed as exactly what Alain had described, a crude criminal whose attempt at psychological warfare had revealed his own moral bankruptcy and spiritual poverty. The other players at the table gradually resumed the game, but the dynamic at the table had fundamentally changed.
Marcel's attempt to establish dominance through cruelty had backfired completely, leaving him diminished and isolated, while Elaine's quiet dignity had elevated him in the estimation of everyone present. Word of what had happened in the Salon Privé that evening spread quickly through Monte Carlo society and eventually throughout the international circles where both men moved. The story became legendary, not just because of the cruelty of Marcel's attack, but because of the extraordinary grace and power with which Elaine had responded. For those who witnessed it, the incident became a defining example of how true strength and character could triumph over intimidation and evil without resorting to violence or revenge. Elaine had defended his brother's honor and his family's dignity while simultaneously exposing the moral emptiness of his attacker, all through the power of words delivered with absolute conviction and unshakable moral authority. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond that single evening in Monte Carlo. Within hours of the confrontation, word had spread throughout the exclusive circles that frequented the casino, and by the following day, the story was being discussed in the highest levels of European society.
For Marcel Antonelli, the humiliation was complete and lasting. His attempt to intimidate Elaine through the cruelest possible means had not only failed spectacularly, but had exposed him as exactly the kind of morally bankrupt individual that civilized society rejected. The sophisticated circles that occasionally tolerated his presence for business reasons now viewed him as someone who had revealed his true character in the most embarrassing way possible. The criminal underworld's reaction was equally significant. Word of how Elaine had responded to Marcel's attack spread through the networks of organized crime throughout Europe, and the universal conclusion was that Marcel had been destroyed by someone who had never raised his voice or made a single threat. For men who understood power and respect, the lesson was clear. True strength could not be intimidated, and authentic dignity was more powerful than any weapon. The incident also had a profound impact on how Elaine was perceived within both legitimate business circles and the entertainment industry. His calm, devastating response to Marcel's attack demonstrated a kind of character and inner strength that enhanced his reputation far beyond his acting ability or business acumen. Film directors and producers who heard the story began to understand that the intensity and authenticity Elaine brought. For Marcel Antonelli, the humiliation was complete and lasting. His attempt to intimidate Elaine through the cruelest possible means had not only failed spectacularly, but had exposed him as exactly the kind of morally bankrupt individual that civilized society rejected. The sophisticated circles that occasionally tolerated his presence for business reasons now viewed him as someone who had revealed his true character in the most embarrassing way possible. The criminal underworld's reaction was equally significant. Word of how Elaine had responded to Marcel's attack spread through the networks of organized crime throughout Europe, and the universal conclusion was that Marcel had been destroyed by someone who had never raised his voice or made a single threat. For men who understood power and respect, the lesson was clear. True strength could not be intimidated, and authentic dignity was more powerful than any weapon. The incident also had a profound impact on how Elaine was perceived within both legitimate business circles and the entertainment industry. His calm, devastating response to Marcel's attack demonstrated a kind of character and inner strength that enhanced his reputation far beyond his acting ability or business acumen. Film directors and producers who heard the story began to understand that the intensity and authenticity Alain brought to his dramatic roles was rooted in genuine depth of character rather than mere acting technique.
His ability to access and project complex emotions while maintaining perfect control was revealed to be based on real experience with pressure and adversity. Business partners and potential investors were equally impressed by the demonstration of character under extreme pressure. The ability to respond to personal attack with such measured effectiveness while never losing moral authority was exactly the kind of leadership quality